Skill of the day. Today's skill of the day is a hip hinge or deadlift pattern. All right, so what we tend to see with most people that come in from a normal gym background or that have had limited exposure to any kind of powerlifting movement, they'll try and squat when it comes to deadlift. So as they go down, they'll try and deadlift from this position or from this position. Now, what happens when we have that really low hip position and we were really concentrating on the quads doing all of the work? It actually really loads through the lower back because our hamstrings aren't quite engaged. So what we need to do and what we are trying to achieve through a hip hinge movement is hinge over at our hips in order to engage our hamstrings. And when our hamstrings are engaged and they're the main mover of the deadlift, then our lower back is just there for support and in that isometric hold. When we're squatting down and we get those hips down really low and we try and deadlift from that position, then our lower back is in a really compromised position. So let's have a look at it from what we tend to generally use, which is a barbell. All right, so first thing we're going to talk about is setup. When we set up, we have a really narrow stance, so our feet want to be underneath our hips. Once we've found that narrow stance, I tend to get set up from the top before I even go down, because it's quite difficult to set up well when you're already down in a deadlift position. So what I focus on here is I squeeze my glutes. This locks my hips forward. This keeps my hips in a good position. I then tighten my belly to lock my rib cage down. I then engage my lats. Now what this does, by squeezing the glutes, we're going to keep the hips neutral. By squeezing the belly, we're going to keep the lower back neutral. And by squeezing the lats, we're going to keep the upper back and shoulder blades all neutral. Once I do that, I then can start my hip hinge over to my barbell. So I then send my hips back, and then I grab a hold of the barbell. From here, I can reposition if I need to. I then brace by breathing into my belly. And then I perform the deadlift. When you're performing the deadlift, focus on driving the weight through your heels as opposed to lifting the weight up. Number two is you need to keep the bar in really close to the body. So if we have a look at our bar path now, as I've set up, notice how it stays just a millimeter off my body the entire time. Even on the way down, to do this, I send my hips back, and then it goes really close to the body. We send the hips back to keep those knees back. This also engages the hamstrings, and it's going to put us into a really good position. All right, so we don't just use a barbell for deadlift. We can use any implement we have available to us. So if we're using a kettlebell, same deal. We're going to hinge over at our hips. We set up at the top, hinge over, grab a hold, set, stand up nice and tall. Again, I send my hips back. Notice how I really engage the glutes and squeeze the quads in order to stand up tall. So I lock my knees back and lock my hips forward by recruiting those muscles. Let's have a look at another piece of equipment. So another piece of equipment we can use if we have that at our disposal is a dumbbell. Now for a dumbbell, normally they're quite light, so we can do it as a single leg deadlift. So all the rules apply that we just went through with the barbell and the kettlebell. We still need to hinge over at our hips. We still need to set up here. We hinge over at our hip, but this time we're going to have this leg travel out in a straight line as a counterbalance. So we hinge over, grab a hold, stand up tall, squeeze the quads and glutes. Again, we hinge over at the hips, touch, and then stand up. So with that one, it does require a little bit of balance also. So it's going to test all those little tiny muscles, those intrinsic muscles that are going to help with that balance. So it's a really good movement if you don't have too much weight. Let's have a look at one more piece. All right, so the sandbag. So with the sandbag, we can do it a couple of different ways. We can go straight on. Just be aware that if we're straight on, the sandbag is going to sit out in front of our midline. We can also go over the top or straddle the sandbag. Now to do this, we're going to send our hips back, get our hands underneath the sandbag, stand up nice and tall. Touch the sandbag into the ground, stand up nice and tall. Let's have a look at it from the side. So we get position, send our hips back. All right, that is the sandbag version of a deadlift. Main points. Main points with the deadlift is, number one, don't let your ego get in the way. You must at all times keep a flat back. Now, if something doesn't quite feel right, something feels tight, it felt like something is just not quite sitting right or feeling right, stop. Yep, don't be silly. Make sure that you keep your good position at all times. Make sure your body is feeling good at all times. Number two is focus and practice on the skills we've just went over. So we hinge over at the hips. Notice how my hips are up a lot higher than my knees and my shoulders are forward of where the weight is sitting. Practice those good technique. Practice that hip hinge movement. Practice keeping good position, and the deadlift is a really safe movement. It's actually going to bulletproof your back from any injury. When it's done poorly, however, the opposite is true. Work on your deadlift, take your time, don't let your ego get in the way, and have fun.